When I picked Allendale County as this year's vacation destination, a lot of people thought that was crazy. While it is true that Allendale is very rural, it has a unique and fascinating history all its own. So, why Allendale? Interestingly, that question was the name of a chapter in a 1940s book called The Town of Allendale. In this book, Allendale is the picture of a quaint town where strangers are welcomed like family with open arms. A place where people couldn't help but come back, and in many cases, even ended up moving to the area. Well, with that kind of appeal, who wouldn't want to visit a place like Allendale County? After camping at Lake Warren State Park, the next morning we drove from Hampton County to Allendale County, which happens to be the smallest county in South Carolina. The first town we drove to was that of Fairfax. As we drove into town, we were greeted by the Allendale County sign, a Fairfax sign, and a line of palm trees that separated us from the railroad track. Our first stop was at the 76 gas station. After picking up some snacks and coffee, we continued exploring the area. Fairfax began as a very small community that over time had a few names. Prior to 1880, at least 6 families lived here. 2 of the families had the last name Sanders. By 1881, W.J. and J.F. Sanders built a post office called Sanders at a crossroads. This crossroads is located where an 1814 store stood, and later the 1851 Bethlehem Church, now known as First Baptist. Later in the area's history, after the Port Royal Railroad was completed, a deck and post office were built in 1873. The train stop was called Campbell Station, and the area began being called Campbellton. By 1890, Mr. Neal started a Standard Oil operation in the town, which supplied surrounding towns and communities with oil and kerosene. The next year, in 1891, after the southbound railroad was completed, a line crossed over the previous railroad. In one interesting story, a local boy drew the name Fairfax out of a railroad official's hat, and that is how the community changed its name. Over time, the community was fortunate to have a railroad, and as a result, continued to grow around the depot. The town of Fairfax was incorporated on March the 2nd of 1896 with Mr. W.J. Sanders as the first mayor. It was rechartered under the general statutes of the state on May 16th of 1898. By 1900, 301 people lived in Fairfax, followed by 499 people in 1910, 957 in 1929, 1,376 in the 1930s, and 1,567 by 1940. Due to this growth, during 1940, a town hall, which contained the offices of the mayor, councilman, and town jail, was erected. According to Wikipedia, the town of Fairfax is 3.3 square miles. According to the Allendale County website, Fairfax has progressed along with businesses, and the town of Fairfax has flourished. In addition, Fairfax is described as a proud community that is home to the Allendale County Hospital and John Edwards Harder Nursing Facility, as well as several prosperous industries, including Scotsman's Ice Makers, and Coosall Farms. In addition, the numerous community churches provide gathering places for its citizens and their families. While the town of Fairfax has added many businesses necessary to make it progressive, today its citizens hope families and businesses will continue to grow. Prior to leaving Fairfax, we made sure to search for some of its historic places. First, we found ourselves at Harmony Baptist Church. The congregation that would become Harmony Baptist Church first gathered in Fairfax in 1830, holding services under a brush arbor, as was typical of early rural churches. Formally organized in 1875, the church was named by its charter member, Sarah Gooding. The first pastor was Reverend H. C. Smart, with W. H. Cone and Mr. Mixon being the first deacons. This simple meeting-style sanctuary was constructed in 1880 on land that was donated by the member Josiah Loadholt. Harmony Baptist Church became part of the Savannah River Association of Baptist Churches. Then, in 1899, Harmony Baptist joined with 3 other local churches to form the Pastoral Field, in which a single pastor would preach to members of all 4 churches twice a month, rotating from church to church. Today, Harmony Baptist Church is affiliated with the nearby Barnville Baptist Church, both of which belong to the Southern Baptist Convention. St. Nicholas Lutheran Church is located in the small community of Jennies, about 8 miles east of Fairfax. St. Nicholas was built in 1910. However, the congregation itself dates at least to 1804. It was organized by early German settlers and was probably associated with the Mount Pleasant Church in Earnhardt, which dates to around 1750. There were several locations before finding a permanent home. One earlier sanctuary, built in 1884, was located about 2 miles north of this site. While the church burned, materials from it were scavenged to build the existing structure. The old St. Nicholas Cemetery is located about 1/3 of a mile away off of South Carolina Highway 641. Someone buried there is Joseph Jenny, son of George and Nancy Varn Jenny. Joseph was the owner of the J.W. Jenny and Company, a turn-of-the-century general store located in Allendale County, South Carolina. The sign from the old store is now on display along with many items from the store at the South Carolina State Museum in Columbia. Joseph was a Confederate veteran who served in Jenkins' Brigade in the 1st South Carolina Regiment under Colonel James R. Hagwood. Joseph was wounded on August the 14th of 1864 at the Second Battle of Deep Bottom in Virginia, and paroled at Appomattox on May 9th of 1865. Bethlehem Baptist Church was organized by 1854 and built its first house of worship near here on land purchased in 1859 from A.R. Stokes. The congregation obtained the land for its present location in 1910 from G.D. Sanders, and the building was completed by 1914. In 1944, the name was changed to First Baptist Church. At this cemetery, there is a marker for Hazel B. Plyler, who was born in 1916. In 1838, he volunteered to join the Navy. In 1942, he served as a fireman aboard an S-class submarine that unfortunately collided with a ship in Panama. He was only 26 when he died at sea. After leaving the cemetery, we went on a search for the Allendale War Memorial. The War Memorial was erected in 1954 by the local camp Woodsmen of the World. It was dedicated in June of 1954 to the memory of the brave men who died that their country might live. While near Town Hall, we took a closer look at the Virginia Durant house next door. It is a Victorian cottage with a 1.5-story frame that rests on brick pillars. The house was built with an irregular U-shaped plan that incorporated a medical office for Dr. Young. The house also served as an office for Mrs. Young's newspaper, the Fairfax Enterprise. She married her husband, Benjamin H. Covington, at age 16. After his death in 1879, she published a short novel called The Outline of Life, which criticized marriage as stifling. She then married Dr. William Jasper Young of Fairfax, South Carolina in 1880. Besides being a newspaper editor, she was the first woman elected to the State Press Association. She worked with Susan B. Anthony as a suffragist. She also lectured and worked to future the work of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Next, we continued our Allendale adventure by traveling towards the town of Sycamore. On our way, we stopped by another historic area and marker. Baker's Mill, which stood on Jackson's Branch, was a grist mill owned by William R. Baker, 1816 to 1869. He was a planter in what was then the Barnwell District. Baker moved to the area in the 1850s and built a house about 2 miles north and established a cotton plantation of 2,000 to 3,000 acres, which he named Sycamore. On February the 2nd of 1865, as General W.T. Sherman's Federals advanced towards Columbia, General F.P. Blair's unit clashed with the Confederate cavalry at the bridge over Jackson's Branch, while the Confederates retreated over the bridge until reinforced after dark. A Confederate withdrawal then opened the way for the Federals' advance to Buford's and Rivers Bridge. This act served to influence the outcome at Buford's and Rivers Bridge. While in the area, I walked over to the nearby bridge just to take a look at the creek. While entering the town of Sycamore, we were greeted by their sign, which displays a John Deere tractor. This is surely a testament to this being a farm town. According to the United States Census Bureau, the town has a total area of 3.2 square miles. As previously mentioned, the town takes its name from Sycamore Plantation, which was named due to the numerous sycamore trees that grew there. Typical to other southern plantations, after the war, the lands were divided and sold. The present community began to develop in 1891 when the railroad came through. By 1897, there was a post office known as Baker's Mill Post Office located on Major Baker's land. Eventually, businesses needed for the community were established, and the community had a physician. By 1912, a section house and depot were built for the Seaboard Railroad. How beautiful Sycamore must have been! In the past, Highway 641 was a dirt road with horse troughs down the center. Here, sycamore trees, chinaberry trees, and daylilies were planted between the troughs. In 1917, the Sycamore Community House was built, which was a 2-story building with the second story used by the Woodsmen of the World. By 1938, the roads were being paved and sidewalks were being built. In addition, during the past, the community had a white and black school known as the Roswell Sycamore School. However, later, both schools were closed and the children were bused to Allendale. Originally, a church was established in a building formerly used as a store. However, in 1965, the present Sycamore Baptist Church was built and is still located on the same site. Today, Sycamore is still a small rural town whose residents are closely connected and enjoy the slow pace of a farming community. According to Wikipedia, the population here as of 2010 was 180 people. However, by 2020, a United States Census stated that there were only 147 people, making up 104 households and 36 families. Most notably, Sycamore at one time was the largest watermelon market in the area. While driving around the small rural town of Sycamore, we, of course, stopped by the farm store, the small post office, and noticed a lot of nice homes on spacious properties. Of course, we also had to take advantage and stop so that we could talk to the livestock.
Hey, baby sheep.
It's not baby sheep. It's baby cows.
Hey.
Hey, pretty.
During our drive to our next stop, we noticed a lot of beautiful scenery. We even passed a very interesting looking old log cabin. On our way to Ulmer, while I didn't get great video of it, I saw the greenest grass that I have ever seen. As it is with most children, during our day, we had to make several stops, one being at an old farm in Ulmer. The surrounding lands of Ulmer once belonged to only two persons, Ephraim Ulmer and John Williams. However, there are authentic records dating back to the 1700s. Notably, the ancestral home of John Williams' family still stands. While here, I tried my best to find his home, but I'm not sure I ever got close. The Williams home was lived in until the 1950s. It may have been erected on the banks of the Salcahatchee River in 1800 and added on to in 1906. Today, Williams House is the oldest house in Ulmer. Although last recorded, its physical condition was less than perfect, the house is connected to a story which caused it to earn the reputation the house Sherman couldn't burn. The story goes that while Mrs. Williams was making syrup cakes, a Union soldier entered, and in an attempt to scare her, he asked, "Have you ever seen a Yankee?" After which he tried to grab her cakes. Knowing the family was almost out of food, she quickly threw flour onto the cakes. The soldier then left the cakes and went to pillage the rest of the house, after which they tried to burn the house, but for some reason it wouldn't catch fire. Later in time, the home continued to hold many treasured William items, such as a carbine rifle that was said to fire accurately at long distances, as well as a portrait of Robert Williams, who was killed 5 minutes before the war ended. Interestingly, the sword Robert was wearing when he died was given to the Allendale 109 Lodge for safekeeping. While in Ulmer, we drove by their church, the Greater Salcahatchee Baptist Church, which was first organized in 1790 along the banks of the Salcahatchee River in the settlement of Buford's Bridge. General Sherman destroyed the first structure at this site, using its materials to build bridges during his march through the South. The current church was built in 1915 after moving to the nearby Ulmer site. In the church's cemetery, Joe Goodson was laid to rest. He was the oldest son of Leroy Goodson Jr. and Ellen Alma Robinson Goodwin. Joey was an E4 in the 25th Infantry Division of the Army. His tour began on January 4th of 1969, and he passed away on March of that year in South Vietnam. As for the town of Ulmer, it was chartered in 1891. On Wikipedia, it states that during 2000, there were 102 people who lived here. However, like Fairfax and Sycamore, the population here also dropped. And it is documented in a 2020 census that only 65 people lived here, which was made up of 23 households and 8 families. On the Allendale County website, it states that through the years, the town of Ulmer's prosperity has ebbed and flowed. But today, Ulmer is a thriving agricultural community whose citizens are close and family-oriented. While we didn't find the Williams home during our time in Ulmer, we did see the largest mud bog. Twitty's Mud Bog hosts a 2-day event during October. This event was so busy when my husband asked if we could have a look around, the man said that if you go in, you probably will not be able to get out. Before leaving Ulmer, we drove back to the fire department and helped with their fundraiser by buying some barbecue and having lunch before moving on. Of course, we couldn't end the first day of our 2-day Allendale County adventure without seeing the town of Allendale and making a few stops. When we arrived to the town of Allendale, we couldn't help but notice some old hotels. That is because 301 in Allendale was once known as the Highway of Southern Hospitality, aka the Tobacco Trail, which once was marketed for tourism. Notably, it was sometimes called the Tobacco Trail as 301 traces the original old trails which were beaten through the wilderness by hogsheads of tobacco rolling to the market behind teams of mules. 301 was completed in the 1940s and runs from Dillon, South Carolina to the Savannah River in Allendale, a distance of 190 miles without tolls or ferries. During the 301's heyday, an article was even entitled, "Scarlet and Red Live Again on the Tobacco Highway." Of course, all good things must come to an end, and when I-95 was completed, the hotels dried up. While in the town of Allendale, we tried to visit the USC Salkehatchie Library, but unfortunately it had already closed. Unbeknown to many, while Allendale is the youngest county, it has the oldest historically significant site in South Carolina. This archaeological site is known as the Topper Site and is named after the resident who made the discovery in a quarry during the 1980s. Originally, it was described as a Clovis site, which is the oldest findings belonging to man. But today, underneath that, even older artifacts have been found. While you cannot visit the site, as it is on property owned by a chemical company, they do occasionally allow tours, and you can see some of the artifacts at the Salkehatchie Library. Later native peoples of the area included the Salkehatchie and the Yamasee tribes. However, after the Yamasee War, most of the peoples who lived here moved to Florida, and along with other dishomed people and escaped slaves became the Seminoles. As we drove through the town of Allendale, we noticed the courthouse and the War Memorial Building, which was built in honor of the Allendale County men who served in World War I. Upon the building's completion in 1950, It housed a library and various offices, including the Veterans Administrative Office. We also took note of the 1915 100,000-gallon standpipe water tower. Interestingly, identical towers can be found in Belton and Walterboro, South Carolina, as this type of tower was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These freestanding pipes typically held water throughout the structure. In the town of Allendale, the standpipe was replaced by a modern water tower in 2009, though the historic tower still stands. After driving by its historic downtown, we stopped at an Allendale marker near the Allendale Municipal Building. This marker was called the Town of Allendale and read, "In 1810, in accordance to an act of the South Carolina General Assembly, the state conveyed a 1,000-acre land grant signed by Governor John Drayton to Benjamin and G. Washington Allen. The acreage included the present town of Allendale, which is presumed to have derived its name from the Allen family. The Allendale Post Office was established here July 11th of 1849. Paul H. Allen was the first postmaster. By 1873, the Post Royal Railroad had completed a line through Allendale. And that same year, the town was incorporated by the South Carolina General Assembly. The town limits extend a 3/4-mile radius from the depot. So that was that. During our first day, we didn't spend a lot of time looking around the town of Allendale because we were in a hurry to see the water. The water in the area was not only important to the indigenous people, but later settlers as well, and used for travel, trade, and of course, leisurely activities. The most important of Allendale's rivers is the Savannah River, which runs 301 miles from the Appalachian Mountains to the sea. Today, the river even forms the lakes of Hartwell, Russell, and Thurman on its way. During my research, because I read that the Savannah River is treacherous, deceptive, and difficult, and as a result, many have perished. So, while visiting, I decided to explore this majestic river by visiting ferries and landings, which were used in early history to transport lumber, livestock, hemp, produce, and even orange juice, and then later used to ship enormous loads of cotton. First, we made our way to Johnson's Landing, located in the Martin community. Family of Colonel Governor Robert Johnson owned the land around Johnson's Landing during the colonial period. Later owners included the Royal Lieutenant Governor Irving, whose estate was confiscated during the Revolutionary War. Interestingly, the Johnson family again came into possession of this estate when two brothers, William and Richard Johnson, from Wadmalaw Island, purchased the 3,000 acres for the sum of $4,000 in 1804. The landing was at that time commercially important, remaining so for many years after. On the other side of the river, near the landing, was once a fine antebellum plantation known as the Orange Grove Plantation. While Orange Grove Plantation was spared by Sherman, it did burn down in 1915. Today, remnants of Orange Grove's huge columns, typical in Southern homes of the time, can still be seen. While there, I thought I might have seen a column, but it was so overgrown that I can't be sure. On the way to our next location, we stopped at the Speedwell Methodist Church. Speedwell Methodist Church was founded in 1885 and was named Speedwell for a stagecoach stop, and then the first post office in the vicinity near Millet. Between 1884 and 1885, O.B. Dunbar and Savannah Baker Bates raised funds for. In 1885, Mary Dunbar Lafayette and her husband John H. Lafayette donated a 5-acre tract here for the church. The first church on this site was built in 1885 and replaced by the present church in 1922 during the pastorate of Reverend W.R. Jones. Unfortunately, it remained unfinished during the Great Depression, but was dedicated in 1941 during the pastorate of Reverend J.A. Graham. During the 1960s, attendance declined, and by 1970, regular services ended. That being said, homecomings are still occasionally held here. The person I chose to talk about who is buried here is William Dunbar of 1752 to 1798. He passed at the age of 46. He was an assistant super of Indian Affairs between 1776 and 1780. In addition, William was a representative from the Orangeburg district to the South Carolina legislature and served in the South Carolina militia. Finally, we reached our next landing, known as Little Hell Landing. Little Hell Landing got its name due to large rocks in the area which would destroy a boat's hull. The landing is located in an area known as Millet. During my research, the book I was reading said that while visiting, make sure to look for islands in the river. In 1922, while the boundary between South Carolina and Georgia would be in the middle of the river, the islands within the river belonged to Georgia. So even the islands at Little Hell Landing above Millet that are so close to the South Carolina shore are technically Georgia. On the way to our next location, we drove by the community of Martin. While there, we noticed a place where railroad cars used to be loaded, and we passed by the Lower Run Cemetery. The Lower Run Cemetery is a historic cemetery that is located on Highway 125. As we traveled through the serene countryside, we enjoyed the peace it offered while on our way to Burton's Ferry. Today, there is a trail that you can hike to get a great view of the 1938 bridge at Burton's Ferry. However, we weren't able to do the hike. As far as the ferry's history, in the early 1700s, Burton's Ferry was the gateway between South Carolina and Georgia for pioneer settlers coming from Virginia. In addition, the ferry is close to the location of the Battle of Wiggins Hill. As the British and Loyalists made camp nearby at the Wiggins Hill Plantation, a Patriot force made of Colonel Hardin and his captain Johnson and McCoy approached. When the Americans came into view, the British formed battle lines. After a heated hour and a half of fighting, the outnumbered Americans were forced to retreat after 7 men were killed and 11 wounded, while the British and Loyalists took on similar casualties. Because of their numbers, they were able to hold their ground. During the retreat, a wounded Colonel Hardin made his way to the Coosawhatchie Swamp, where he was treated and fed by 3 patriots named William Rawls, Carlton Rawls, and Leonard Tanner. After the fray, the Native Americans and Loyalists tortured their own scout, Wiley, as they felt the encounter was the result of a setup. The British, Loyalist, and Native American groups then went on to hang Britton Williams, Charles Blunt, Abraham Smith, George Smith, Randall McCoy, George Reed, and others. In fact, the 16-year-old Tanner McCoy was hung as his mother begged for his life by their loyalist neighbors for not giving up the location of his fellow patriots. After this war erupted between neighbors, later acts of aggression between locals at Kings Creek, Pike Creek, Matthews Bluff, Burton's Ferry, and Stone Landing at the Belfast Plantation occurred. Most men in the area joined the Pipes Creek Company of Light Horse and were part of the Gainesville County Regiment. This company rendered service in both Georgia and South Carolina. In fact, the company found themselves in Savannah in 1776, during its fall in 1778, and in 1779, when the French and Patriot forces tried to recapture the city. That year, the company was also at the Battle of Beaufort and with General Ashe at the Battle of Briar Creek. While these men were away, it left their women and children vulnerable to Loyalist and Native American attack. An example of this brutality can be seen by reading the August 18th, 1779 letter of James Moore. In this letter, he writes, "A party of 20 painted white men and 80 Indians crossed the river near Black Swamp on horseback and burned a house and retrieved 4 scalps. They also took 3 women and most of the slaves from the Cowper's plantation. In addition, 14 horses were taken, and women and children were left with no blankets or clothing to cover their nakedness." As we continued to head to the last landing, Matthews Bluff, I told my family about its history. One of the earliest settlements along the Savannah River, in many records, Matthew Bluff is mentioned as early as the 1750s. In March 1779, in order to flee the disastrous Battle of Briar Creek in Georgia, the Patriots floated on logs or swam across the Savannah River. Their commander, General John Ashe, actually took refuge at Matthews Bluff. By April of 1781, Captain Nathan Johnson and Captain James McCoy were stationed here to watch the river and monitor communications between the British. Eventually, 1 officer, 10 soldiers, and 20 loyalists from Augusta were sent to dislodge Johnson and McCoy's men. The force met, an altercation ensued, in which the British officer, Lieutenant Kempt, was killed. Today, this ferry is also referred to as Cohen's Ferry. According to tradition, this is because after the war between the states, 2 Jewish brothers whose surnames were Cohen built a store and warehouse just north of here. Next, we drove to Kings Creek Campground, which is where I wanted to camp before I realized we would have the entire Lake Warren State Park to ourselves. That being said, Kings Creek Campground is a great campground that caters to campers, equestrians, and hunters. In fact, I had originally planned to purchase some beef from IGA and cook it over a fire. This was not only to be for fun, but also so I could talk about how, after the Revolutionary War, the entire region began dealing with cattle. We drove back towards Allendale, and on our way, we saw some really cool older buildings and a lot of older farm equipment. During the trip, we stopped at the Smyrna Baptist Church marker. However, unfortunately, you couldn't see the church due to a fallen tree. As you would expect, the town of Allendale is the county seat. In a 2020 census, the population of the town of Allendale was 2,694. The town itself has a total area of 3.3 square miles. The majority of the residents here are African American. Most of the residents here do own their own home and land. However, sadly, Allendale is one of the poorest areas in South Carolina. As a result, a lot of land is being sold as people leave looking for better opportunities. While in downtown, an interesting building caught my eye. The Art Deco Theater in Allendale was a popular downtown cinema from the late 1920s through the 1960s. Originally called the Pastime Theater, the name was changed to the Carolina Theater under the management of F. H. Moody and E. A. Crocker. The one-screen, 382-seat movie house closed in the mid-20th century, along with many other businesses in this western South Carolina area, as Interstate 95 drew travelers away from town centers. The University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie, acquired the theater building in 1983. In 2007, the school received a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, and from the Savannah River Nuclear Solutions to restore the theater and convert it to a performance arts center. Numerous local businesses also contributed to the project, as well as the University of South Carolina Columbia's Arts Department. Upon completion of the new theater, the name was changed yet again to the Carolina Theater to reflect its past as a beloved cinema. The theater is used by the community as well as schools for arts and cultural events. During this drive, and as the sun set, I couldn't help but think about the book I read about Allendale and all of the interesting people of the past. Jerome Wilson recounts spending time and fishing the river as a boy with his childhood friends, whose father owned a lumber business in the swamp near the bluff. He described it as a Huck Finn experience that he cherished throughout his life. Miss Ethel Rouse remembered a steamer that would dock at Cohen's Bluff and play music, and how all the ladies and gentlemen would board the Katy with its red velvet drapes to play games and enjoy the scenery. Mr. Bill Wright owned a grist mill and a cotton gin on Railroad Avenue, but was mostly remembered by his mean shepherd dog named Rollo and his talking crow, which would holler, "Hello!" and shut up to those walking by. According to one book, the author declared that Allendale produced more beautiful and charming women in its time than any other place that he had ever visited. In 1896, Miss Corina Season started the Allendale Pen and Press paper. In the book, The Town of Allendale, another recounts how Roy Stoney planted 2,000 acres of watermelons, and how Dr. William Hayes bought the first car. After the purchase, the car had to be worked on for an hour to get it to start, and no one knew how to stop it, so they had to drive it until it ran out of gas. Before sunrise, we packed up and headed back to Allendale County. Our first mission was to find Dead Man's Rock, located somewhere at the Allendale and Barnwell County border, 3 miles from the little village of Lyndhurst, also known as Bowling Springs, near Lower Three Run Creek. Originally a site of Allendale, named for its first postmaster, Paul Allen. In 1849, Sherman's troops under General Kilpatrick camped here, and the town moved to its present site in 1873. If you're wondering about the story of Dead Man's Rock, it can be found in several books and online. As you may have inferred, the rock marks the location of a murder. In the Barnwell People Sentinel of 1925, an article reads, "Beside a straggling country road, there is a giant flat rock covered with tangled vines and creeping lichens. The casual passerby is unaware of it, save as a hill or mound that are common to the area, once known as Rocky Point." In 1770, Rocky Point was comprised of 40,000 acres, which was granted to Daniel Miller from the king. In the area, Daniel and his business partner operated a sawmill and the first machine shop in the state. Notably, the location of the shop at the time the article was written still had a visible dam. In addition, the first house in Barnwell, known as the Joyce Mixon Place, was said to have been built from wood and materials from the plant. Eventually, the shop began making many things, including wagons and rifles. The rifles here were special, as all of the rifles had silver mountings. Apparently, Mr. Daniel Miller would supply the silver via a secret mine that no one knew the location of but him. While there is a lot of speculation on who killed Mr. Miller, one day Mr. Miller and his partner found squatters on the land and forced them to leave. Eventually, it was decided that in an act of retaliation, these squatters murdered Mr. Miller on his way to church. While he lay dead on the rock, one hand was still tightly gripping his horse's reins. Shortly after this tragedy, less than a year later, Miller's partner also lost his life, this time by poisoning. There then followed a period of such fear, many members left the area and fled to another state. Eventually, Daniel Miller's daughter Cornelia did return to the area and lived out her life in Allendale County. However, as of the publication of this news article, many of Miller's descendants were located elsewhere throughout the state. While we didn't have any luck finding Dead Man's Rock, we got to see some really beautiful views and ended up turning around in Barnwell at Tarleton Brown's resting place. While he is buried in Barnwell, Tarleton Brown is mentioned frequently in Allendale's books, a hero in the eyes of those who lived in Allendale and surrounding areas. As a boy, he lived in Albemarle County, Virginia. Brown's family later settled on Briar Creek, opposite of Burton's Ferry. He lived a rugged existence, which required endless stamina. Initially, he and his family lived in a bark tent until a log cabin could be built. Brown and his family lived alone in a dense forest where wild animals, including wild horses, roamed. When the Revolutionary War broke out, his father was murdered by a group of Tories when he was only 12. Tarleton served as a private in the South Carolina militia in 1774, and he fought at the Siege of Savannah and the Battle of Monk's Corner, after which Tarleton was commissioned as lieutenant. Later, Mr. Brown was a coroner and sheriff in Winton County in 1788, a grist mill owner in 1789, and a South Carolina State House Representative from 1792 to 1797. Between 1794 and 1808, Brown was a lieutenant colonel of the 23rd Regiment, a South Carolina state senator, and a sheriff of Barnwell County. By 1862, he had a book published, The Memoirs of Tarleton Brown. and at one time his portrait hung in the library at Barnwell, though I'm unsure if it is still there today. Tarleton Brown was buried at an old Baptist graveyard where a church once stood on land given by himself. His tombstone is still standing, and a newer marker was placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Prior to giving up completely on finding Dead Man's Rock, we drove down a dirt road that was in the Landhurst, Bowling Springs, and Red Hill Road area.
I feel like we're really close, but we just don't have time to spend all day looking for a pile of rocks. So we've been on Bowling Springs Road. Now we found Landhurst. Don't know where. It could be anywhere in this area.
Before leaving the area, my husband even had me walk through a giant field.
I don't see nothing. I don't see anything.
Next, we drove back to the Martin area in search of the Creek Plantation to see if they still raised longhorns. Prior to our visit to Allendale, I knew that I wanted to ride by many of the plantations just to see if I could get a glimpse of the house from the road. In the book, The Town of Allendale, it states that during the antebellum period, many of the enslaved people in the area lived in tidy, whitewashed cabins, forced to dwell on the fertile land, which contained cotton, sugar, and corn, stretching as far as the eye could see. On the other hand, Allendale also has a past of grandeur, which was financed on the backs of others' rights and liberties. In another book about Allendale and the Savannah River, it encourages readers to picture the antebellum period and what it might have been like to have been lucky enough to afford a lavish lifestyle and a large home along the river. Apparently, weddings were often held within the home, where guests would be entertained by piano. After the ceremony, guests would enter a banquet hall where delectable foods and homemade wines would be tasted. After which, everyone would head to the landing, where silver china glistened and coffee was served, and everyone listened for the music of an approaching steamboat. When the boat did arrive, the cheerful crowd would board and head to a new destination. Beneath the low-hung lanterns on the deck, the waving bride and groom would wave on their guest until the vessel was out of sight. Then the newlyweds would head to the house and steal a few moments of privacy before the guest would return, as many of them would stay in the family home as lodging before heading back to their respectable homes by horse and carriage. As previously mentioned, the Katy was one such boat. It is believed to have been named after the daughter of its builder, the Honorable John Lawton. And while forgotten today, the boat was once important to the economical and social lives of those who lived here. Next, we drove back to the Allendale and Hampton County border, past Cohen's Landing to Solomon's Crossroads. Unfortunately, I have lost my notes about Solomon's Crossroads. However, I do remember this area being a place of the first settlement. It was named after Mr. Robert Solomon, who owned a vast estate in the area. And I also recall that the area was associated with moonshine and, at one time, crime. While trying to verify this, I found information about Groughton's Plantation nearby. According to SouthCarolinaPlantations.com, Charles Maynard Jr. was a sharecropper, and so was his father. Whoever wrote about the plantation stated that my great-great-grandfather and grandmother were slaves there. Charles Maynard Sr. was burned alive in his home because he worked for this family for his entire life
and they promised him a piece of land for his family. Rather than keep their word, he was killed. His wife and son came back from church at Pipe Creek one Sunday and found the house burnt to the ground. My grandfather became the man of the house at the age of only 12. Silas and Henry Maynor, Cornelius and Margaret Maynor, and Mr. and Mrs. Harry Hopkins are buried there. That I can't remember what was famous about it.
The name?
Solomon's Crossroad. Anyway, I'll remember. Besides the Creek Plantation, which was acquired in 1968 by Billy Morris as an opportunity to pursue his lifelong interest in horse and cattle breeding, other plantations we tried to see included the Belfast Plantation, which was originally confiscated from its owner for being a loyalist, and then in 1817 served as a boarding school for young ladies. The Gravel Hill Plantation, which was the home of Mr. Lawton, the builder of the Katy. The house was built in 1856 by its first owner, Benjamin Willingham, who helped raise 18 children in it. Not only was its beauty renowned, but the water from its well was described as pure and sweet, and the land had various fruit trees. The Irvington Plantation, constructed in 1828 by Dr. William Robinson Irwin, notably the good doctor, his wife, and his sister-in-law were all excommunicated from Kirkland Church in 1833 for their affiliation with other denominations. However, they did form the Second Christian Congregation, the Disciples of Christ in South Carolina, and they held weekly meetings at Irvington until 1835, when the present meeting house was completed and dedicated as Antioch Christian Church, and the Robwood House in the village of Appleton. This house was built in a colonial style in 1853. Later, the home was remodeled by a French architect who was once a soldier in the Franco-Persian War. During this time, while working on the house, he would often invite Mrs. Maud Walker Guess over to tell her stories of his adventures and battles while she was in town during her summer vacation from Converse College. Of course, it would take me too long to talk about all of the other grand homes in the area, like the Grimmick Plantation, Rose Lawn, Cedar Hall, and the George T. Printer House. Unfortunately, as a result of the Civil War, many of the beautiful homes in the area were lost, including Senator B. Thomas's home, Bonnywood. The Bo Peep Plantation, which was owned by Mr. Bostick, and in a letter was recorded by a Union soldier as having a beautiful marble front, and the Seminole Plantation, which not only had a notable house, but also a racetrack. While homes were a small price to pay in keeping America whole, after the Civil War, many people found themselves in dire situations, many without homes or a way to survive. Over time, the area was rebuilt, and things in Allendale slowly improved. During my research, I was astonished to find that a book claimed that the black and white citizens of the area got along during this time, and even up until the 1940s when the book was written. However, regardless of that, it is fair to assume that some of the powerful and wealthy white men in the area were not happy about giving Northerners or newly freed slaves political power. Even here in Allendale, that was evident by the appearance of gun clubs and the red shirts throughout South Carolina. While not in Allendale County, murders even occurred in the state as a result, such as the Hamburg Massacre. During my research, I did read of one unfortunate story where a black Allendale merchant who ran for a position of postmaster was forced to sell his store and ran out of town. However, I will say in later history, I have found much more evidence to support the stance that the people of Allendale do support each other. In fact, the astonishing ability and disposition of the Allendale people to live and work together with genuine hospitality is illustrated several times in books. Notably, the first brick building in Allendale was erected by Mr. Bill Goog, who hired a reputable black contractor named John Eve. In 1905, a group of interested citizens organized a library and housed it in an office of Mr. J. M. Patterson. And in 1919, when Allendale County was formed, the library became a county library, one of the first in South Carolina. Even prior to the Civil Rights Movement, many of the Allendale men of color were being praised for their leadership in the community, and at least 2 churches served people regardless of their color. Between 1921 and 1922, Allendale's first and only courthouse was built, and instead of Robert Mills, it was designed by G. Lloyd Pritchard, a native son of Allendale County. The people of Allendale have also been described as a people with a never-failing spirit. For example, during the Depression, when stores in small towns all over the nation began to close, the people of Allendale again came together. They worked regardless of pay and helped feed and clothe one another and carry on. Another incident occurred in the 1980s when the KKK actually sued the town of Allendale for not allowing a parade to occur. To me, this love for one another during times of trouble is truly what Allendale County should hold on to and be proud of. After picking up an early lunch at the Allendale Hardys, we drove to Miss Arnold's schoolhouse, which is a one-room 19th century schoolhouse that is still standing in the city of Allendale. It was constructed by Dr. R.P. Searson during the 1870s of white pine exterior planks from roof to floor. Miss Arnold was prominently known in educational circles in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee, and her teaching extended over a period of 50 years. She died in 1930 at the age of 85. After the first Allendale Public School was built on the corner of Main Street and Bay Street, Miss Arnold closed her school and taught in the public school. While we drove around just for fun, it influenced me to make a list of what the people of the past would have done in Allendale for fun. After some research, I wrote the following. Dances were listed by several different people. In fact, the Tinctum Ball of 1898 was described as a memorable affair and held in Gill's old stables. There was a time when the Allendale Guard was once rated the finest cavalry company in the South Carolina militia. The Guard would host picnics at the old Willingham place. During one such picnic, a young boy grabbed Mrs. Walker's pound cake and ran off into the woods. People once walked the streets of the town to meet up and talk. In fact, according to the book, The Town of Allendale, the streets were once filled with the Afro-American dialect common in the Low Country, which was an eloquent language that many old-timers knew and loved. There was also a time in history when those in Allendale could take trips on trains to various places, like Blackwell, Blackville, and Columbia. Many would take picnic excursions. Of course, at one time, Allendale had 4 fast trains, and people would even go daily to New York or Florida. During the Prohibition, the men of Allendale had several clubs where members could play poker and share alcohol. In addition, chicken fights were also a common activity throughout the Allendale countryside. John Robinson's circus would sometimes come to town. During one of these times, a boy by the name of Tom Barker gave an elephant a chew of tobacco, which the elephant sprayed in Barker's eyes and on those nearby. According to Ethel Ross Breland, the mill pond was once a popular place for folks to go picnic or fish under the tremendous oaks. She also recounts that one of her favorite activities as a child was sitting and watching the mill wheels grind corn. According to another citizen, a prize fight once occurred in the area. It was between the champion and Fred Hughes, a railroad engineer. Fred punched the former champion so hard he went over the ropes. Even more interesting to the story, the match was held where the Allendale Bank would be built. It is also documented that for entertainment, people would attend court. All the high-class dames would dress up in their bridge costumes and hats. Mr. Reynolds' store on Old Orangeburg Road was also a former hangout, and folks would gather there on Saturdays to socialize and get their mail. On Saturday afternoons, people would watch the Smyrna and Greystone baseball teams play at John Gray's place. There once was even a famous auto race, which took place from Allendale to Barnwell, in which Brooks Lawton won. The county was once so proud of their history that they even gave historical tours to guests where they would be taken to Smyrna Church and shown historic family portraits of those who once lived in the area. Other things mentioned included blackberry picking, spelling bees, egg-eating contest, playing marbles, shooting fireworks at Christmas, and looking for arrowheads. Even the author of The Town of Allendale, Lewis Searson, reminisces on his time as a child in the area where he would play sports, hunt, fish, ride horses, and swim until the frogs came out a-singing. Next, we went on the mission to try and find Bostic Pond and the Coosawhatchie and Salkehatchie rivers. An early pond created by a mill, Bostic Pond had a few interesting moments in history. Unfortunately, as its own private property, I wasn't able to get a very clear view of the pond. During Tarleton's Brown service, on one occasion, he was unable to fight, so he sent William Bryan to fight on his behalf. Later in life, when Bryan died, he was buried near the Bostic Pond. During the Civil War, it is said that when Sherman's army was in the area, out of hatred for the South, they threw several markers, including Bryan's, into the nearby Bostic Pond. Of course, you may be wondering, what can I do when visiting Allendale County besides riding around and looking at historical markers, buildings, and churches? Well, if you decide to visit Allendale today, there are still a few locally owned restaurants and stores worth visiting. In addition, you may want to experience the Allendale Farmers Market, visit Paradise Motocross, go to a historical society event, see a performance at the Carolina Theater, watch a mud bog, get an ice cream, go to a park, watch a high school sporting event, explore neighboring counties,
Enjoy the Fairfax Country Club, boat down the waterways, hike the Lower Savannah River Alliance Greenway, see the Native American artifacts at the USC Library, or visit the Allendale or Fairfax Library and ask for a book published by a local writer like Ann Miller, the author of Our Family Circle. Not to mention, there's always fishing or hunting at one of the many preserves. Or staying at a resort like the Butterfield Plantation, which is an all-inclusive resort for groups of 6 that includes meals, horseback riding, trails, fishing, hunting, and much more. Of course, if you're like me, you will enjoy just riding on the Tobacco Road or one of the many dirt roads and looking around. In conclusion, while Allendale County has faced a series of economic and social challenges that has led to the area being labeled a ghost town, poor, neglected, hopeless, and a vivid failure, I personally don't find that to be true at all. I believe Allendale's future is bright as people continue to move to the state looking for slower-paced southern living. Of course, what will set Allendale apart from other places is its cheap housing, its friendly people, its irresistible atmosphere, scenic beauty, and, of course, having the sweetest watermelon on the face of the earth. I hope you enjoyed this video, and the next time you plan to take a trip on Interstate 95, you reconsider and take a quick detour to see Allendale, South Carolina.